Hey guys, welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be reacting to
European empires in conflict, the history of the Crimean War.
Beginning in the 18th century, the powerful Ottoman Empire began to decline. Constant palace and provincial uprisings weakened the country. This began to be used by neighbors, who, in constant wars, seized its possessions and sometimes even invaded deep into Ottoman lands, supporting the uprising in the provinces. The reason for another war was the question of Christian pilgrims. The Russian Empire wanted to gain the right to protect and provide for pilgrims living in the Ottoman Empire, as well as to act on behalf of Christians there. The Sultan, who denied his right to Russia, granted it to France. The Russian Empire reacted by force. In June, the Russian army invaded and occupied the Danubian principalities, which were under the protectorate of the Ottoman Sultan. The Russian emperor demanded the resumption of negotiations with the Ottoman Empire, but in Istanbul they refused to make concessions and began to prepare for war. 3 European states sided with the Ottoman Empire. Britain did not want Russia to have access to the Mediterranean because it did not need another competitor in the maritime trade. In addition, the British concluded several trade agreements with the Ottoman Empire and did not want to miss the benefits of them. France also wanted to expand its influence over the Ottoman Empire through beneficial trade relations. The new French emperor needed a small, victorious war to raise his authority in the eyes of the French, because only last year he carried out a coup that made him a monarch. He was also incited by a personal insult due to a failed correspondence with the Russian emperor. The Kingdom of Sardinia wanted an alliance with France before the unification of Italy, so it hurried to support the Ottoman Empire and join this war. The Russian Empire had hoped to receive assistance from Austria, given that Russian troops had once helped the Austrians suppress the Hungarian Revolution. However, the Austrian emperor did not want to interfere in the war with Britain and France. Moreover, he perceived the occupation of the Danubian principalities as a threat to his empire, as Austria also claimed these lands. Therefore, the Austrian troops were transferred to the borders. This put the Russian army in danger of encirclement. However, the Russian commander did not dare to withdraw his troops back to Russia. In September, the Turks issued an ultimatum to the Russians, demanding the withdrawal of troops from the Danubian principality.
This is very interesting, but so the whole Crimea thing goes back all the way back to the Ottoman Empire? That's kind of crazy, wow.
The Russian army did not comply. So in October 1853, Turkish troops crossed the Danube and shelled the Russian crossings on the River Pruth and conducted several minor battles. This was the beginning of the war. In the Caucasus, even before the war began, significant troops from both sides gathered. Hoping to catch the enemy by surprise, the Turks were the first to attack, but their advance halted at the siege of the border fortresses. After several small skirmishes, which did not bring any side the desired result, Russia received reinforcement from local Georgian princes and went on a counter-offensive. Near Baskadikler, they were able to defeat the Turks. Russia also decided to destroy the Turkish fleet. A squadron of 12 ships, led by Admiral Pavel Nakhimov, headed for the Turkish coast. At the end of November, 2 fleets fought at Sinop. The Turks had the same number of ships and were reinforced with guns from the shore, but the Russians met them unprepared for battle, and so quickly defeated them. As winter came, Nakhimov did not want to stay in unfamiliar lands, and therefore quickly returned to Sevastopol. At the same time, the Ottoman army was not afraid of the winter and tried to drive the Russians out of Wallachia. They forced the Russians to retreat at the Battle of Sitate. The Turks, however, also suffered significant.
because I would think the Russians are they're used to the cold.
I'm also surprised, but I would think the Russians would want to. It would be because like Russians way more experienced in the cold than the Turks are. So the fact that the Turks wanted the cold and not the Russians, that's a little interesting.
Losses, and therefore did not pursue the enemy, but returned to the Danube. When Russian reinforcements arrived in the spring of 1854, they crossed the Danube and laid siege to Silistria. The British and French sent their fleet to Turkey in the summer of 1853. However, it did not participate in hostilities until these countries declared war on the Russian Empire in March 1854. At the same time, the British shelled Odessa and Ochakov, and then landed troops near Varna. This finally forced the Russians to lift the siege of Silistria. The Russians agreed to leave the Danubian principalities, but did not renounce their other claims to the Ottoman Empire. The Allies then decided to strike Crimea to force Nicholas I to negotiate. In the summer of 1854, the British and French sent a flotilla of 60 ships to the Baltic Sea. It had 15,000 soldiers. The Allies initially captured the Alan Islands and converted them into their base to bombard and burn city ports on the Finnish coast. In order to prevent the British from destroying Kronstadt, the Russians mined the Gulf of Finland, blocking the exit of their Baltic fleet. These events will go down in British history as the Åland War. In September 1854, the Franco-British squadron besieged Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky. They failed to take the fort by surprise, but it did not matter because the Russians still did not intend to hold the city. Lacking enough troops to defend themselves, they left with the onset of winter and ferocious.
Russia needs to have a lot of troops to manage this whole border.
It's a big ass country, yeah. They have to have a lot of people.
Snow. In late 1854, the British ship Miranda bombed Kola and Solovki, but the main theater of war had already deployed on the other side of the Russian Empire. In September 1854, British and French troops landed near Yevpatoria. The Allied fleet in Crimea was numerous. Its 400 ships carried about 60,000 soldiers. Against this, the Russians could send as many of their own troops, but half of them were scattered throughout Crimea in small garrisons. The rest were in Sevastopol under the command of General Alexander Menshikov and went to meet the French-British landing party. It should be noted that a significant problem of the Russian army compared to the European was recruitment. Recruits were recruited forcibly from serfs or criminals, who were given a choice between hard labor and military service. Such soldiers were far less motivated than British or French soldiers, who were then recruited at the general call. In the battle on the Alma River, the Russians were defeated and forced to retreat to Sevastopol. At the same time, General Menshikov left Sevastopol with part of the troops, leaving in the city only sailors and marines under the command of Admiral Vladimir Kornilov. In late September, the British occupied Balaklava, completely cutting off Sevastopol from the rest of the Russian troops. Menshikov waited for the army of General Gorchakov from the Danubian principalities to arrive in October and sent 25,000 soldiers to Balaklava to unlock Sevastopol. The Russians were the first to attack the Turkish positions, hoping that the Turks would quickly lose. But this plan did not prove itself.
Wow.
The Ottoman army stood in position until the British came, and together they repulsed the Russians. It was in this battle that the infamous attack of light cavalry occurred, when the British Cavalry Brigade misunderstood the order, attacked the Russians through the valley, fired from Russian guns. 100 of the 600 cavalrymen were killed in the attack, and about 150 were wounded. Although the Russians declared victory in battle and rewarded many Russian commanders for it, they never achieved the main goal, to unlock Sevastopol. So, in early November, Menshikov sent 40,000 soldiers to Inkerman. But here they were met by well-fortified positions of the British and French. After a day of storming, the Russians suffered more than 10,000.
Who?
How did Russia declare a win? Because they won the fight, but they didn't unlock Sevastopol.
It was like a baby win, not the whole, not a win-win.
Casualties, and eventually retreated from the battlefield. In Sevastopol itself, the situation was even worse. Although Admiral Kornilov put 35,000 men to arms, mainly due to the mobilization of port workers, there were still not enough soldiers for the defense. Because of the siege, medicines and supplies stopped arriving in the city. Defenders lacked gunpowder and ammunition. For every 10 Allied shots, the Russians answered only 3. The city itself was under constant shelling from ships. Admiral Kornilov died on the first day of the bombardment. He was replaced by Admiral Nakhimov, who ordered his ships to be sunk to prevent British ships from entering Sevastopol Bay. However, the plan to quickly take Sevastopol did not materialize, and the British and French had to prepare for a long siege. In January 1855, the Turks transferred from the Danube to the Crimea part of their troops under the command of Omar Pasha. General Menshikov once again tried to defeat them, hoping for a quick victory. However, in the Battle of Yevpatoria, the Russians were defeated by the Turks and were forced to retreat. Due to numerous defeats, Emperor Nicholas I ordered the dismissal of General Menshikov from the post of Minister of War and appointed General Gorchakov as Commander-in-Chief of the Russian troops in Crimea. But soon, the Russian emperor...
So I wondered, the dismissal, was it just like a polite, okay, you know, gotta go retire, or was it just kill? Just basically kill him.
Died, and his son Alexander II replaced him on the throne. After the death of Nicholas II in the territory of the Kiev and Chernihiv provinces, rumors spread among the peasants, as if before his death the emperor issued a manifesto that will liberate from serfdom all peasants who left for the war. In fact, Nicholas II issued a very different decree on the next recruitment. But the rumors spread so much that the peasants began to form military units, expel nobles and gendarmes from their villages, and declare that they wanted to go to war. The rebels began to call themselves Cossacks, in honor of free warriors who once defended Ukrainian lands, and their rebellion was called Kiev Cossackdom. The new Russian emperor had to redeploy troops from neighboring governorates to suppress.
Yeah, it seems like it sucks for Russia. They're getting fucked from all the angles. Like, I guess because it's such a big territory from all the sides, and even from the within now, we have something coming.
I'm curious, for Russia, how they got all this land in the first place?
Conquered it?
Yeah, but I don't know how they conquered it. Their conquer story.
I can't tell you that either, but just somehow
Like,
conquered
did
it.
they start off little and then it became big? Or
Probably, yeah.
the Kiev Cossackdom. In the spring of 1855, the Russians besieged Kars to distract the enemy from the siege of Sevastopol. In response, the French flotilla set out for the Sea of Azov. Here, they captured Kerch and Temriuk, and during the summer burned all the Azov ports. The British at that time bombed Anapa and Novorossiysk and captured Taman. The British tried to negotiate with the Circassians to raise a rebellion against the Russians, but these attempts failed due to the disunity of the Circassian clans. Turkish commander Omar Pasha landed with his army in Abkhazia at this time, and, having received assistance from local Georgian princes, managed to capture it temporarily. In the same spring, artillery shelling of Sevastopol intensified. 6,000 people died from the shelling that occurred at Easter. However, most died from poor medical care due to lack of medication. Due to a shortage of shells, Russian gunners were given only 10 shells a day. French reinforcements also
fuck is
arrived
supposed
at
to
the
do that,
walls of
do that?
Sevastopol.
You can't even protect yourself.
Not
Then
really.
what kind of stuff is that?
And
I
along with
guess also to ensure that you use it to, to make your target and not to, waste it.
Yeah, but if you run out of it, you fuck. Like what? This is basically setting up your troops to fail.
him 25,000 Sardinian soldiers from the Kingdom of Sardinia. In early summer in June, Admiral Nakhimov died during an inspection of the fortifications. Alexander II demanded that General Gorchakov release Sevastopol. Although the general warned the emperor that the troops were not ready, he had to obey orders. In August 1855, he gathered 60,000 soldiers and went to Sevastopol. The British and French attacked the Russians on the Chernaya River as they crossed the Traktir Bridge. This position did not give Gorchakov any possibility to strike back, so the British and the French shot Russian soldiers with impunity. Suffering losses of almost 10,000 soldiers, Gorchakov ordered the retreat. In the same month, the French were able to capture the Malakov Kurgan, a height that not only allowed better shelling of Sevastopol, but also opened the way to the assault of the walls. That is what the Allies did. In Sevastopol, there was no hope of outside help. The Russians surrendered the southern part of Sevastopol. On 30 August 1855, the British and French occupied the entire city. Napoleon III did not intend to end the war, but hoped to move the fighting to the rest of Russian lands. In the autumn, the French, supported by the British, captured the forts on the Kinburn Spit. However, the British were no longer willing to continue fighting. In the Caucasus, meanwhile, the Turks lost Abkhazia, and the Turkish troops in Kars surrendered to the Russians after a 6-month siege. Russian Emperor Alexander II also did not want to continue the war. For the purpose of ending the war, diplomatic negotiations began in winter of 1856. They ended on 30 March with the signing of the peace treaty in Paris. According to it, Russia renounced all claims to the Ottoman Empire, as well as returned lands seized during this war, and agreed not to interfere in the internal affairs of the Ottoman Empire, and not to keep a navy in the Black Sea. The Crimean War, although short-lived, had a huge impact. It brought
Interesting though. So this is the Crimean War. I honestly thought this would talk about the current war with Ukraine that's going on. When the title said the history of the Crimean War, I didn't realize that this is Crimean War like from back in the day.
So this is the initial beef. Now it's interesting the parties that took sides and where they stand today too.
Yeah, I didn't realize there was like some sort of Crimean issues like 150 years ago. That's interesting.
Brought France back to some of Europe's most powerful countries, confirmed the advantage of the British Navy, and raised the prestige of Piedmont. It had the most negative consequences for the Russian Empire, which started the war. Moscow realized how technologically backward they were, and that it is not worth hoping for quick victories. Against the background of the Crimean War, many peasant uprisings broke out in the empire, which eventually led to the decision of Alexander II to start real reforms, including the abolition of serfdom and modernization of various spheres of life. The Ottoman Empire was able to stay within its borders for another 50 years. However, unlike Russia, their defeat did not encourage reforms. Although the Turkish Sultan made several attempts of this kind, they were all futile. Palace intrigues and uprisings in the provinces continued. In addition, the Ottoman Empire took many loans from France and England during the war, which it would not be able to return till the end of its existence.
Oh, interesting.
Can I see the comments?
So they basically dissipated, broke. Interesting. Yeah, I really thought this was gonna be like the 2014 war, or like thought we would segue somehow into 2014.
Yeah.
If Britain and France didn't participate, the city of Bosphorus Strait would have been Constantinople, not Istanbul. The Ottoman capital was still called Constantinople in 1850s. They wrote a song about it. So while how often the British and French would team up to keep the status quo when trade was good and didn't want any hiccups.
Same this year, today as well. Okay, guys, of course, let us know your thoughts. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Join the Discord, and as always, share as much kindness as possible.